22 years. That's all it took from the first shots at Geonosis to the Emperor's death at Endor. And in that window, the Empire erased an entire species so completely that most of the galaxy never noticed 100 billion people were gone. 100 billion. The human brain cannot process that number. We hear it, we nod, we move on, but we don't feel it. 100 billion is approximately 10 times the maximum sustainable population of Earth. If you tried counting to that number, speaking 1 digit per second without stopping to sleep or eat, you'd be counting for 3,170 years. If each Geonosian life was represented by a single grain of sand, you'd have enough to bury city blocks under dunes that scraped the clouds. This wasn't the elimination of an army, wasn't the destruction of a government. This was the extinction of a civilization, one of the galaxy's oldest industrial species, reduced to a single survivor hiding in abandoned tunnels, while the rest of the universe argued about Skywalkers and Senate politics. And almost nobody cared, because they were bugs. But here's what makes this story darker than simple xenophobic genocide. The Geonosians weren't killed because they were hated. They weren't killed because they were feared. They were killed because they were useful. They had built the most terrifying weapon the galaxy had ever conceived, and for that crime, for being indispensable, they were rewarded with systematic extermination. The Empire didn't murder 100 billion Geonosians to neutralize a threat. The Empire murdered them to bury a receipt. The case I'm presenting today isn't about biology or planetary geography or caste systems. You can find that elsewhere. This is a prosecutor's closing argument about witness elimination, about whether what happened on Geonosis was legitimate security protocol or the quietest genocide in galactic history, executed specifically to ensure the galaxy never learned who actually constructed the Death Star. The defense gets to speak first. That's how fair trials work. So let's give them the floor. Here's the case for the Empire. The Geonosians numbered 100 billion individuals. That figure alone should trigger strategic alarm in any military planner's mind. 100 billion, organized not as scattered settlements squabbling over resources, but as a unified hive structure with collective coordination that humanoid species couldn't match. When a Geonosian queen issued a directive, millions moved as one organism. No debate, no dissent, no committees or bureaucratic delays, just instantaneous compliance rippling through tunnel networks that stretched kilometers beneath the planet's surface. Their weapons manufacturing capacity was staggering. The droid foundries of Geonosis had produced the battle droid armies that killed Republic soldiers by the thousands throughout the Clone Wars. Battle droids stamped out on assembly lines that never stopped, the foundries outputting millions annually. At peak output, Geonosian droid foundries alone could output millions of battle droids annually. They'd sided with the Separatists. They'd built Count Dooku's armies. They'd proven, repeatedly, that their industrial output could shift the balance of power between entire civilizations. And then there were the sonic weapons. Geonosian soldiers carried sonic weapons capable of devastating organic tissue while leaving surrounding machinery undamaged, turning humanoid opponents into screaming heaps while factory equipment remained pristine. Their warriors attacked through underground caverns and across the red desert surface from angles that ground troops couldn't easily counter. Their hive structures created defensive advantages that made any planetary assault a meat grinder for invading forces, as the Republic learned twice, at enormous cost. So when defenders of imperial policy look at Geonosis, they don't see innocent civilians. They see a species that could, at any moment, rebuild the droid armies, reignite the war, threaten imperial stability with manufacturing capacity that dwarfed most core worlds. From a pure threat assessment perspective, leaving 100 billion potential enemies alive, enemies with proven military capability, proven hostility to central galactic authority, proven industrial power, might look like strategic negligence rather than moral courage. That's the defense, and it's not stupid. The Geonosians had chosen their side in a galactic civil war, and they'd chosen wrong. The Republic won. The Republic became the Empire. And occupied populations of former enemy species don't typically get to negotiate their post-war status from positions of strength. Harsh? Yes. Unprecedented? Hardly. But here's where the defense case starts to crack. Threat elimination and witness elimination are different crimes wearing the same mask. The distinction isn't in the body count. It's in the timing. A threat is neutralized during hostilities or immediately after. You don't wait. You can't wait. Military doctrine across every species and every era agrees on this basic principle. If an enemy poses existential risk, you act while you still have overwhelming force, while your justification is fresh, while the galaxy will accept necessary harshness as the cost of victory. If the Geonosians were such an existential danger, the moment to act was the end of the Clone Wars. Anti-separatist sentiment was white-hot. The Geonosians' alliance with Dooku was fresh in public memory. The newly christened Empire could have announced a final pacification campaign, crushed the hives with orbital bombardment, and the galaxy would have applauded. One last battle, one final victory, the threat eliminated before it could regenerate. That's not what happened. The Clone Wars ended. The Separatists surrendered. Order 66 was executed. The Republic became the Empire. And through all of it, Geonosis remained under occupation, bruised, diminished, monitored, but alive. Years passed. Imperial garrisons maintained order. The hives were watched. The population was tracked. And if threat neutralization had truly been the goal, those years of relative quiet should have been evidence that the threat was already contained. The Geonosians weren't rebuilding droid armies. They weren't plotting insurrection. They were a defeated species under military occupation, doing what defeated species under military occupation do: surviving. Then, around 9 BBY, years after the peace, the Empire returned, with gas canisters and sterilization protocols. That's not the timeline of security. That's the timeline of destroying evidence before trial. So what evidence needed destroying? To understand why 100 billion Geonosians had to die, you need to understand what they knew, what they'd built, what they could testify to if anyone ever bothered to ask. The Death Star was not born in Imperial shipyards under Tarkin's watchful eye. It wasn't a post-war innovation dreamed up by Emperor Palpatine to cement his new galactic order. The weapon's origins stretched back years before the Empire existed, back to the Clone Wars themselves, back to a secret so explosive that the good guys were already planning to kill everyone who knew about it. The Geonosians designed the Death Star, not just manufactured components under contract, not just followed orders from distant masters. They created the original plans in their underground foundries, solved the fundamental engineering problems that had stymied Republic theorists, figured out how to focus a super laser capable of destroying entire worlds. Poggle the Lesser, Archduke of Geonosis and leader of his species, personally oversaw the early construction phases. His engineers understood why each system existed, how each component interacted with the others, what compromises had been necessary to make the design functional. They knew the gravitational stresses on spherical superstructures at that scale. They knew the power routing requirements for the superlaser. They knew the industrial logistics required to move materials measured in planetary masses from mining operations across the galaxy to the construction site. This wasn't assembly line work. This was deep engineering, the kind that requires understanding where the weak points are. The Death Star was conceived in the hive warrens of Geonosis itself, sketched on holographic displays by insectoid engineers. The Geonosians transformed theoretical concepts into buildable reality. Their foundries began constructing the first structural components while the Clone Wars raged across the galaxy. The Republic captured Geonosis twice during the conflict, and both times, intelligence officers must have noticed that the underground factories were building something far more sophisticated than battle droids. But the project was already classified at levels that kept most of the Republic's own military commanders ignorant. Here's the part that matters most for the prosecution's case. The Geonosians knew when the project started. They knew who was involved. The Death Star's origins traced back to the Republic itself, to secret projects that would eventually continue seamlessly under Imperial authority. Even while the Senate debated humanitarian concerns, and Jedi generals championed peace and justice, elements within the Republic government were already investing resources in a weapon capable of destroying entire planets. The transition from Republic project to Imperial project was seamless, because it wasn't really a transition at all. The same people kept working on the same weapon under a different flag. The Geonosians could testify to this. A single Geonosian engineer reaching rebel intelligence networks could have provided schematics, weak points, construction timelines. Could have revealed that the Empire's terrifying superweapon wasn't some new tyrannical innovation, but a Republic project, conceived under the same Jedi generals the Empire now claimed were traitors to civilization. Could have demonstrated that the peaceful Republic had been building genocide-capable technology while its citizens debated trade disputes in the Senate. Imagine that testimony at a galactic tribunal. Imagine holorecords showing Republic officials signing off on planet-killer research. Imagine the Empire's entire propaganda narrative, that it brought order from chaos, that it protected civilization from separatist aggression, collapsing under the weight of evidence that the Republic was planning mass murder before the first battle droid ever rolled off a Geonosian assembly line. The Geonosians weren't dangerous because they might rebuild droid armies. They were dangerous because they could talk. They were the receipt, and receipts get burned. The question of who ordered the burning leads us to two men whose decisions shaped the Death Star's development and the fate of Geonosis: Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin and director Orson Krennic. Tarkin was the calculating strategist who would eventually command the completed station. Cold, utterly convinced that fear was the only reliable instrument of governance, Tarkin understood that the Death Star's value lay not in its ability to destroy planets, though that capability was certainly useful, but in its ability to make destruction unnecessary. A weapon so terrifying that no system would dare resist. A gun so big that pointing it was sufficient. Pull the trigger once or twice, make an example, and the rest of the galaxy would fall in line forever. But this calculus only worked if the galaxy believed the Death Star was invincible. If the construction history leaked, if the designers were known, if vulnerabilities were cataloged by anyone with reason to share them, the weapon's psychological power would collapse. The Death Star's mystique depended on it appearing from nowhere, a technological miracle that only the Empire could produce. Let the galaxy learn that the actual engineering had been done by bugs in underground factories, and suddenly the miracle looked considerably less miraculous. Tarkin didn't build plans with single points of failure. He didn't leave loose ends dangling. When he looked at Geonosis, he saw a planet-sized liability, a repository of dangerous knowledge that could surface at any moment to undermine everything the Death Star was meant to accomplish. Krennic's relationship with the Geonosians ran deep. As the director who oversaw much of the Death Star's construction, he'd worked with Geonosian engineers for years, relied on their expertise to solve problems that stumped his own teams. Krennic had worked closely with Geonosian engineers, had seen firsthand their capabilities and their knowledge. The Catalyst novel reveals the intimate connections between Death Star development and Geonosian technical knowledge, the way Imperial engineers had hit walls that only non-human problem-solving could breach. Krennic understood, perhaps better than Tarkin, exactly what information would die with each Geonosian life. He knew the specific technical contributions they'd made. He knew which components bore their design fingerprints. He knew that the weapon he'd spent years building rested on a foundation of Geonosian engineering brilliance. And he knew that foundation had to be erased. Both men agreed on one point. The Geonosians could not be allowed to survive once the station was complete. Tarkin saw the Geonosians primarily as a security risk, witnesses who could compromise the station's mystique. Krennic saw them as a labor pool that had served its purpose, workers who might be recruited by competitors if left alive, engineers who might sell their expertise to the highest bidder, technicians who knew too much about the specific systems they'd helped design. Both conclusions led to the same recommendation. After whispers of a superweapon began circulating through intelligence networks, whispers that threatened to expose what Tarkin had worked so carefully to conceal, he made his move. The Death Star construction was relocated to Scarif, far from its birthplace, hidden behind shield gates and classification levels. And Tarkin ordered the sterilization of Geonosis, specifically to silence what he called any potential loose ends. Not enemy combatants, not military threats, loose ends. The language of document shredding. The language of destroying evidence before audit. Tarkin spoke of the Geonosians the way an embezzler speaks of inconvenient records. They weren't people to be eliminated. They were problems to be solved. The method of elimination tells you everything about the intent. If the Empire had wanted to neutralize a military threat, orbital bombardment would have been faster, cheaper, and more complete. Turn the surface to glass, leave the ruins as a warning to other species considering rebellion. Standard Imperial doctrine, applied dozens of times across the galaxy to planets that had defied the Emperor's will. That's not what they did. Instead, around 9 BBY, Imperial forces deployed poison. Gas canisters containing toxic insecticide, specifically engineered for Geonosian biology, were distributed systematically across the planet. The deployment wasn't a military operation in any traditional sense. It was the work of technicians following protocols, bureaucrats executing orders, specialists calibrating dispersal patterns, officers filing reports that would be classified and buried. The chemicals were precisely calibrated. They attacked the unique biochemistry that allowed Geonosians to process their world's thin atmosphere, causing respiratory systems to collapse within hours of exposure. But killing adults wasn't enough. The agents were also designed to penetrate the protective shells surrounding developing larvae, killing eggs before they could hatch. Any survivors found their reproductive systems destroyed by the targeted compounds, making them biologically incapable of continuing their species. This wasn't merely genocide. This was extinction by design, a final solution engineered with the same cold precision that characterized the Death Star itself. And here's the detail that should make you pause. The gas left infrastructure intact. The hive spires still stood after the populations inside had choked to death. The underground factories remained operational, silent, empty, but undamaged. The industrial equipment that had produced battle droids and Death Star components waited for Imperial salvage teams to arrive and begin cataloging what could be repurposed. The Geonosians' productive capacity wasn't destroyed, it was appropriated. Their workers were eliminated, but their work remained. That's not how you neutralize a military threat. A threat requires destruction, not preservation. You destroy the capability itself, not just the beings who operated it. You leave ruins and wreckage, not functioning assembly lines. But that's exactly how you eliminate witnesses while keeping the crime scene useful. The Empire wanted the factories. The Empire wanted the equipment. The Empire wanted everything the Geonosians had built. The Empire just didn't want the Geonosians. Consider the scale of what was accomplished. The sterilization destroyed all but one of the 100 billion Geonosians, making it the single largest genocide ever committed by the Galactic Empire. For context, the Jedi Purge, Order 66, eliminated perhaps 10,000 Force sensitives across the entire galaxy. The destruction of Alderaan, the atrocity that galvanized the rebellion and haunts galactic memory, destroyed an entire world. The Geonosian sterilization dwarfed both in sheer numbers. 100 billion is not just larger than the population of most planets. It represents a fundamentally different category of crime. The elimination not of a population, but of a species. Not of a civilization, but of a biological lineage stretching back millions of years. And yet, the Jedi Purge haunts the galaxy's memory. It is mourned. It is commemorated. It generated a rebellion. Survivors spent decades hunting down the perpetrators, seeking justice or revenge, ensuring that history remembered what had been done. The destruction of Alderaan created martyrs and heroes. The destruction became a galvanizing symbol of resistance, precisely because an entire homeworld had been murdered. The Death Star's demonstration of power backfired strategically because the galaxy finally understood what Imperial rule actually meant. The Geonosian sterilization passed almost without notice. No monuments mark the hive spires that became mass graves. No holovids memorialize the billions who choked on Imperial gas. No rebellion formed to avenge them. No survivors spent their lives seeking justice. 100 billion dead, and the galaxy shrugged. Why? Because the path to genocide is paved in incremental dehumanizations, small permissions that accumulate until atrocity feels not merely possible, but inevitable. For the Geonosians, that path was laid during the Clone Wars, when the Republic's citizen soldiers learned to see them not as a species, not as people with their own civilization and history and culture, but as targets. The Battle of Geonosis, the very first engagement of the Clone Wars, established the template. Clones and Jedi swept through hive complexes, lightsabers and blaster fire illuminating the dusty air, and the casualty counts that emerged bore a telling asymmetry. Republic losses were mourned. Geonosian deaths were tallied. "Good thing those bugs can't aim." The phrase echoed through clone barracks across the galaxy. It became a running joke in the Grand Army of the Republic, mutated into 1,000 variations, appeared in graffiti scrawled on the hulls of gunships and the walls of mess halls. 6 words, carrying within them everything that made genocide psychologically possible. Bugs. Not Geonosians. Not soldiers defending their homeworld. Not engineers or workers or parents or children. Bugs. Things that scuttle in the dark, to be stepped on without remorse, to be exterminated without guilt. The clones who cracked that joke weren't evil men. They were doing what soldiers in every war have done, finding ways to make the killing bearable, ways to sleep at night, ways to pull the trigger again tomorrow. But the joke accomplished something more insidious than simple morale management. It established, in the collective consciousness of the Republic's military, that Geonosian deaths didn't carry the moral weight of humanoid deaths. It created a category of being that could be killed in unlimited numbers without requiring justification, without triggering guilt, without demanding the psychological processing that killing real people requires. The dark irony would take years to become apparent. Clone troopers laughing about Geonosian marksmanship were, unknowingly, laying groundwork for an atrocity they couldn't have imagined. They were fighting alongside Jedi generals who would soon be executed by those same soldiers, serving a republic that was already transforming into the Empire even as they celebrated their victories. The jokes they told about bugs who couldn't aim were rehearsals for a future they couldn't see, a future in which following orders to gas those bugs would feel less like murder and more like sanitation. 2 devastating invasions during the Clone Wars killed millions of Geonosians. Millions. Not combatants, civilians killed in collapsing hive spires, larvae who never hatched, workers who'd never held a weapon. Orbital bombardment didn't distinguish between military installations and population centers. The First Battle of Geonosis opened the war. Republic forces descended on the planet's droid foundries with overwhelming force. What should have been a surgical Jedi rescue mission, transforming into full-scale planetary invasion once the clone army revealed itself. Geonosian warriors poured from their hives, sonic weapons shrieking, and died in their thousands against disciplined clone formations that advanced with mechanical precision. The Second Battle of Geonosis, years later, was worse. Republic strategists had learned from the first engagement. This time, they came not merely to disrupt, but to devastate. Orbital bombardment preceded ground assault. Whole hive spires were reduced to rubble before a single clone set boot on the surface. The Geonosians, for all their billions, couldn't match the Republic's ability to project force from orbit, couldn't defend against ships that rained fire from beyond the atmosphere. These invasions normalized the slaughter. They framed Geonosians purely as military targets, rather than a civilian population deserving protection under galactic conventions. When the second battle ended, the survivors were treated as a defeated enemy population, not as victims of war requiring reconstruction and reconciliation, but as a threat that had been temporarily suppressed. And here's the split in the audience that tells you everything. Some fans look at the Geonosians and say, they are treated like things to shoot or cut down, rather than an actual people. They see sentient beings, alien, yes, but no less deserving of moral consideration than Twi'leks or Rhodians or humans. They look at the sterilization and see genocide, pure and simple, one of the worst crimes ever committed in that galaxy far, far away. Other fans look at the same facts and conclude, the Empire did a good thing getting rid of those horrible bugs. Both camps are vocal, both are sincere, and the divide between them reveals something that extends far beyond Star Wars lore. We're wired to feel empathy more easily for faces that look like ours, eyes we can read, expressions we recognize, voices that carry emotional tones we've evolved to interpret. The Geonosians had mandibles instead of mouths, compound eyes instead of pupils, chitinous exoskeletons instead of soft skin. Their emotions, if they experienced them the way we do, were invisible to humanoid perception. Their social structures, hives, queens, drones, triggered associations with insects rather than people. So when 100 billion of them die, our brains register it differently than they would if the same number of humans had been killed. A lot of bugs got killed, rather than a civilization was exterminated. The Empire understood this. They counted on it. The galaxy didn't mourn the Geonosians because the galaxy never thought of them as people worth mourning. That's not just convenient for propaganda. That's the precondition for genocide happening at all. Somewhere around this point in the story, we need to address something. Everything I've described, the total extinction, the single survivor, the species reduced to one queen with one egg hiding in collapsed tunnels. That's Disney canon. That's the official lore since Disney declared previous continuity non-canonical upon acquiring Lucasfilm. And some of you watching this are already thinking the words before I say them. In Legends, the expanded universe that existed before the mouse bought the franchise, the Geonosians weren't exterminated. Not completely. The Empire still committed atrocities on Geonosis, still slaughtered millions, still tried to bury what they'd done, but survivors existed. The species limped forward into an uncertain future, diminished and scattered, but not extinct. If you're one of those fans who never accepted Disney's continuity reset, who still considers the old EU the real Star Wars, here's your bone. In the lore that mattered to you, they survived. Disney canon took a darker path. Canon sources confirmed that Geonosis was effectively lifeless by the time rebels investigating the planet's suspicious silence arrived years after the sterilization. A dead world, its hive spires empty tombs, its atmosphere silent except for wind howling through tunnels that once housed billions. The rebels found evidence of the extermination. The gas canisters, the mass graves, the infrastructure eerily preserved, while every living thing had been eliminated. And they found Click-Clack, a single Geonosian, hiding in the deepest tunnels, protecting a queen who had somehow survived the initial extermination, and eggs that would ultimately prove futile, hatching only sterile offspring, incapable of continuing the species. One survivor out of 100 billion. The show didn't dwell on this. A few episodes, a rescue mission, and then the characters moved on to other adventures, other planets, other crises. They left Geonosis to its silence, and the audience was expected to move on too. 100 billion dead, and it barely registered in the narrative. That's the quietest genocide in galactic history. Not quiet because it was hidden, though it was, but quiet because nobody who survived cared enough to make noise. The cover-up succeeded beyond even Tarkin's expectations. Think about the logistics of concealing 100 billion deaths. In any normal galaxy, population collapse on that scale would generate attention. Trade routes would be disrupted. Supply chains would break. Diplomatic inquiries would be launched. Journalists would ask questions. Intelligence agencies would notice patterns. But Geonosis had been under military occupation since the Clone Wars ended. Its trade had already been redirected through Imperial channels. Its communications had already been monitored and restricted. Its population had already been isolated from the broader galactic community. So when the hives went silent, the galaxy interpreted it exactly how the Empire intended, as the natural result of a devastated world slowly dying under occupation. Quarantine protocols were cited. Safety concerns were mentioned. Industrial accidents and environmental hazards were suggested. The few travelers who might have questioned the absence of Geonosian activity were told the planet was dangerous, its atmosphere compromised, its tunnels unstable. Don't go there. Nothing to see. No HoloNet reports discussed the sterilization. No news droids broke the story. No investigative journalists connected the dots between a suddenly empty planet and the massive construction project hiding above Scarif. The Empire's information control was absolute, and the galaxy's indifference was complete. The Rebellion, the one organization with both the motive and the intelligence capacity to expose Imperial crimes, apparently never used Geonosis as propaganda. Think about that. The rebels were desperate for anything that might turn public opinion against the Empire, anything that might convince neutral systems to join their cause. Evidence of genocide against 100 billion sentient beings should have been exactly the kind of atrocity that galvanized resistance. Either they didn't know, or they calculated that the galaxy wouldn't care about bug people anyway. Either explanation is damning. 100 billion, gone without an obituary. The Death Star's construction continued without interruption after the Geonosians were eliminated. Human engineers, vetted and monitored and disposable in their own way, replaced the alien workers who had solved the project's hardest problems. The station grew in secret above Scarif, its origins obscured, its history classified, its witnesses silenced. When the Death Star was finally completed, when it emerged from hiding to threaten the galaxy, it did so as an imperial miracle, a testament to human engineering, human ingenuity, human supremacy. The propaganda made no mention of the bugs who'd actually designed the superlaser focusing arrays, made no mention of the hive engineers who'd calculated stress tolerances on the spherical superstructure, made no mention of the 100 billion workers whose elimination had been the project's final cost. The receipt was burned. The galaxy believed what it was told. And when the Death Star was destroyed at Yavin, achieved in part because its design vulnerabilities were not as thoroughly concealed as the Empire had hoped, the irony was complete. The Geonosians might have warned someone about those weaknesses, if anyone had thought to ask them before killing them all. Here's where the prosecutor rests. But the prosecutor doesn't claim to know the verdict, because there's a question at the center of all this that I can't answer for you, and neither can anyone else. Was this threat neutralization or witness elimination? The Empire's defenders would argue that every point I've made is circumstantial. Yes, the Geonosians built the Death Star, but they also built the droid armies that killed Republic soldiers by the thousands. Yes, the timing was suspicious, but strategic patience isn't evidence of malice. Sometimes threats need to be managed before they're eliminated. Yes, the method preserved infrastructure, but efficient conquest often does. Why destroy useful factories when you can capture them? You could construct a defense case that holds together. You could argue that 100 billion potential enemies, with hive mind coordination and massive industrial capacity, and a documented history of hostility to galactic government, couldn't be allowed to exist, regardless of what they knew about the Death Star. You could argue that the Empire was harsh, but not irrational, that the sterilization was an extreme response to an extreme situation, motivated by legitimate security concerns rather than cover-up paranoia. You could argue that witness elimination is a theory imposed on events that have simpler explanations, that prosecutors see conspiracies where military planners saw strategic necessities. But you'd have to ignore the language. Loose ends. You'd have to ignore the secrecy, the classification levels, the quarantine protocols, the complete absence of public acknowledgement. You'd have to ignore the fact that Tarkin didn't just destroy an enemy. He destroyed everyone who could verify where the Death Star came from and who ordered it built. You'd have to ignore that the Geonosians were killed years after they stopped being a military threat. Killed not during war, but during occupation. Not in battle, but in their beds. Not by soldiers, but by technicians following sterilization protocols. The Geonosians were not killed because they were dangerous. They were killed because they were useful. That's the irony that makes this story darker than simple conquest. Their engineering brilliance, the very capability that made them invaluable to the Death Star project, made them too dangerous to live once the project neared completion. The better they were at their jobs, the more they understood. The more they understood, the more they could reveal. The more they could reveal, the more essential their silence became. They were murdered for being good at what the Empire forced them to do. The defense says the bugs were dangerous, that the Empire did what empires do, that 100 billion potential enemies, with hive coordination and industrial capacity and a history of hostility, couldn't be allowed to exist. The prosecution says the timing tells a different story, that you don't wait years to neutralize a threat, that you don't use sterilization agents to defeat an enemy, that you don't preserve factories while eliminating workers unless you're hiding something other than military victory. The jury is you, and the jury is going to stay hung, because some of you will watch this and feel the weight of 100 billion lives snuffed out in silence. You'll conclude that the Empire committed one of the most monstrous crimes in galactic history, and that the only reason nobody talks about it is that the victims were too alien to count as people, too insectoid to trigger empathy, too different to deserve the mourning that humans and humanoids receive automatically. And some of you will watch this and conclude that the Empire was harsh but not wrong, that the Geonosians brought destruction upon themselves by choosing the wrong side in a war they helped start, that threat elimination, however brutal, is sometimes necessary in a galaxy where failure means extinction for your own species. Both of you can cite facts. Both of you can construct arguments. Both of you will leave this video more convinced of what you already believed. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. 22 years. Less time than it takes a human to reach full adulthood. Less than the span between a child's first breath and their independence. Less than the gap between graduating school and watching your own kids graduate. In that narrow window, the Empire rose from the ashes of a republic that was already corrupt, built a weapon capable of destroying worlds, erased the species that made that weapon possible, used the weapon to murder billions more on Alderaan, lost the weapon to a lucky shot that exploited the very kind of design flaw the Geonosians might have explained to someone, built another Death Star, lost that one too, and collapsed when a Sith Lord finally turned against his master. 22 years of tyranny. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, while the galaxy was distracted by Jedi and rebels and Skywalkers and family drama that spanned generations, 100 billion people were gassed in their hives and written out of history. The sterilization of Geonosis is the quietest genocide in galactic history. Not because it was secret, though it was, but because nobody who survived cared enough to remember. The receipt was burned, the witnesses were silenced, and in the empty tunnels of a dead world, even that last remnant was eventually discovered and appropriated by Imperial forces, Darth Vader himself seizing what remained for the Empire's purposes. 100 billion Geonosians built the Death Star. Then the Empire erased every last one, and the galaxy went on spinning. Subscribe for more stories like this.